Chapter 3. Developments from 300 to c. 1200 CE. The period between 300 and 1200 was a time of many changes. Great civilizations rose and fell. Some of India's most impressive works of art were created. Philosophy and religion developed. Islam entered the mix of cultures that would enrich the subcontinent. From 300 to 750 CE. Historians once regarded the Gupta period, c. 320 to 540, as the classical age of India, the period during which the norms of Indian literature, art, architecture, and philosophy were established. It was also thought to have been an age of material prosperity, particularly among the urban elite, and of Renaissance Hinduism. Some of these assumptions have been questioned by more extensive studies of the post-modern, pre-Gupta period. Archaeological evidence from the earlier Kushan levels suggests greater material prosperity, to such a degree that some historians argue for an urban decline in the Gupta period. Much of Gupta literature and art derived from that of earlier periods, and Renaissance Hinduism is probably more correctly dated to the post-Gupta time. The Gupta realm, although less extensive than that of the Mauryas, did encompass the northern half and central parts of the subcontinent. The Gupta period also has been called an imperial age, but the administrative centralization so characteristic of an imperial system is less apparent than during the Mauryan period. Northern India under the Guptas. The Guptas, a comparatively unknown family, came from either Magad or eastern Uttar Pradesh. The third king, Chandragupta I, reigned c. 320 to c. 330, took the title of Maharajadhiraja. He married a Lichavi princess, an event celebrated in a series of gold coins. It has been suggested that, if the Guptas ruled in Prayaga, present-day Allahabad in eastern Uttar Pradesh, the marriage alliance may have added Magad to their domain. The Gupta era began in 320, but it is not clear whether this date commemorated the accession of Chandragupta or the assumption of the status of independence. Chandragupta appointed his son Samudragupta, reigned c. 330 to c. 380, to succeed him about 330, according to a long eulogy to Samudragupta inscribed on a pillar at Allahabad. The coins of an obscure prince, Kacha, suggest that there may have been contenders for the throne. Samudragupta's campaigns took him in various directions and resulted in many conquests. Not all the conquered regions were annexed, but the range of operations established the military prowess of the Guptas. Samudragupta acquired Patliputra, present-day Patna, which was to become the Gupta capital. Proceeding down the eastern coast, he also conquered the states of Dakshinpatha, but reinstated the vanquished rulers. Among those he rendered subservient were the rulers of Aryavart, various forest chiefs, the northern oligarchies, and border states in the east, in addition to Nepal. Modestant dominions brought within Samudragupta's orbit were regarded as subordinate. These comprised the king of kings of the northwest, the Shakas, the Murundas, and the inhabitants of all the islands, including Singla, Sri Lanka, all of which are listed in the inscription at Allahabad. It would seem that the campaign extended Gupta power in northern and eastern India and virtually eliminated the oligarchies and the minor kings of central India and the Ganges Valley. The identity of the islands remains problematic, as they could either have been the ones close to India or those of Southeast Asia, with which communication had increased. The Ganges Valley and central India were the areas under direct administrative control. The campaign in the eastern coastal areas may have been prompted by the desire to acquire the trading wealth of these regions. The grim image of Samudragupta as a military conqueror is ameliorated, however, by references to his love of poetry and by coins on which he is depicted playing the lyre. Samudragupta was succeeded about 380 by his son Chandragupta II, reigned c. 380 to c. 415, though there is some evidence that there may have been an intermediate ruler. Chandragupta II's major campaign was against the Shaka rulers of Ujjain, the success of which was celebrated in a series of silver coins. Gupta interest lay not merely in the political control of the West, but in the wealth the area derived from trade with Western and Southeastern Asia. Gupta territory adjoining the northern Deccan was secured through a marriage alliance with the Vaktaka dynasty, the successors of the Satavahanas in the area. Although Chandragupta I took the title of Vikramaditya, son of valor, his reign is associated more with cultural and intellectual achievements than with military campaigns. His Chinese contemporary Faxian, a Buddhist monk, travelled in India and left an account of his impressions. The first hint of a fresh invasion from the northwest comes in the reign of Chandragupta's son and successor, Kumaragupta, reigned c. 415 to 455. The threat was that of a group known in Indian sources as the Hunas or Huns, though it is not clear whether this group had any relations to the Huns of European history. They were in any event a branch of a Central Asian group known as the Hephthalites. Skandagupta, c. 455 to 467, who succeeded Kumaragupta, and his successors all had to face the full-fledged invasion of the Hunas. Skandagupta managed to rally Gupta's strength for a while, but after his death the situation deteriorated. Dissensions within the royal family added to the problem. Gupta genealogies of this period show considerable variance in their succession lists. By the mid-6th century, when the dynasty apparently came to an end, the kingdom had dwindled to a small size. Northern India and parts of central India were in the hands of the Hunas. Administratively, the Gupta kingdom was divided into provinces called Deshas or Bhuktis, and these in turn into smaller units, the Pradeshas or Vishayas. The provinces were governed by Kumaramatyas, high imperial officers or members of the royal family. A decentralization of authority is evident from the composition of the municipal board, Adhishanadikrana, which consisted of the guild president, Nagrashresthin, the chief merchant, Sartvaha, and representatives of the artisans and of the scribes. During that period the term Samantha, which originally meant neighbor, was beginning to be applied to intermediaries who had been given grants of land or to conquered feudatory rulers. There was also a noticeable tendency for some of the higher administrative offices to become hereditary. The lack of firm control over conquered areas led to their resuming independence. The repeated military action that this necessitated may have strained the kingdom's resources. The coming of the Hunas brought northern India once more into close contact with Central Asia, and a number of Central Asian tribes migrated into India. It has been suggested that the Gurjaras, who gradually spread to various parts of northern India, may be identified with the Khazars, a Turkic people of Central Asia. The Huna invasion challenged the stability of the Gupta kingdom, even though the ultimate decline may have been caused by internal factors. A severe blow was the resultant disruption of the Central Asian trade and the decline in the income that northern India had derived from it. Some of the North Indian tribes migrated to other regions, and this movement of peoples effected changes in the social structure of the post-Gupta period. The rise of Rajput families and Kshatriya dynasties is associated by some scholars with tribal chiefs in these new areas. The first Huna king in India was Tormana, early 6th century, whose inscriptions have been found as far south as Aran, Madhya Pradesh. His son Mihirakula, a patron of Shaivism, is recorded in Buddhist tradition as uncouth and extremely cruel. The Gupta rulers, together with Yashodharman of Malwa, seem to have confronted Mihirakula and forced him back to the north. Ultimately, his kingdom was limited to Kashmir and Punjab, with its capital at Shakla, possibly present-day Sialkot. Pune power declined after his reign. Successor states to the Guptas. Of the kingdoms that arose as inheritors of the Gupta territory, the most important were those of Vallabhi, Saurashtra and Kathiawar, Gujarata, originally the area near Jodhpur, believed to be the nucleus of the later Pratihara kingdom, Nandipuri, near Bharuch, Mokhari, Magad, the kingdom of the later Guptas, in the area between Malwa and Magad, and those of Bengal, Nepal, and Kamrupa, in the Assam valley. Orissa, Kongoda, was under the Mana and Shalodbhava dynasties before being conquered by Shashanka, king of Gora, Lower Bengal. In the early 7th century, Shashanka annexed a substantial part of the Ganges valley, where he came into conflict with the Mokharis and the rising Pushabhuti dynasty of Thanesar, north of Delhi. The Pushpabhuti dynasty aspired to imperial status during the reign of Harshavardhana. Sthanvishwara, Thanesar, appears to have been a small principality, probably under the suzerainty of the Guptas. Harsha came to the throne in 606 and ruled for 41 years. The first of the major historical biographies, in Sanskrit, the Harshakarita. Deeds of Harsha was written by Bana, a celebrated author attached to his court, and contains information on Harsha's early life. A fuller account of the period is given by the Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang, who travelled through India and stayed for some time at a monastery at Nalanda. Harsha acquired Kannauj in Farrukhabad district, which became the eponymous capital of his large kingdom. He waged a major but unsuccessful campaign against Pulkeshin II, a king of the Chalukya dynasty of the northern Deccan, and was confined to the northern half of the subcontinent. Nor was his success spectacular in western India against Vallabh, Nandipur, and Sindh, lower Indus Valley. In his eastern campaign, however, Harsha met with little resistance, Shashanka having died in 636, and acquired Magad, Vanga, and Kongoda, Orissa. His alliance with Bhaskarvarman of Kamrupa, Assam, proved helpful. Although Harsha failed to build an empire, his kingdom was of no mean size, and he earned the reputation of being the preeminent ruler of the north. He is remembered as the author of 3 Sanskrit plays, Ratnaval, Pradarshika, and Nagananda, the theme of the last indicating his interest in Buddhist thought. The Tang Emperor of China, Tejong, sent a series of embassies to Harsha, establishing closer ties between the two realms. After the death of Harsha, the kingdom of Kannauj entered a period of decline until the early 8th century, when it revived with the rise of Yashovarman, who is eulogized in the Prakrit poem Godavdha, the slaying of the king of Gora, by Vakpati. Yashovarman came into conflict with Lalitaditya, the king of Kashmir of the Karkota dynasty, and appears to have been defeated. In the 8th century, the rising power in western India was that of the Gurjara Pratiharas. The Rajput dynasty of the Guhilla had its center in Mewar, with Chitta as its base. The Kappa family was associated with the city of Anahilpatka, present-day Patan, and are involved in early Rajput history. In the Haryana region, the Tomara Rajputs, Tomara dynasty, originally feudatories of the Gurjara Pratiharas, founded the city of Dhillika, modern Delhi, in 736. The political pattern of this time reveals a rebirth of regionalism and of new political and economic structures. In the early 8th century, a new power base was established briefly with the arrival of the Arabs in Sindh. Inscriptions of the Western Indian dynasties speak of controlling the tide of the Mlecha, which has been interpreted in this case to mean the Arabs. Some Indian sources usate term Yavna. The conquest of Sindh marked the easternmost extent of Arab territorial control. A 13th century Persian translation of a chronicle from Sindh, the Chachname, gives an account of these events. The initial naval expedition met with failure, so the Arabs conducted an overland campaign. The Arab hold on Sindh was loose at first, and the local chiefs remained virtually independent, but by 724 the invaders had established direct rule, with a governor representing the Muslim Caliph. Arab attempts to advance into Punjab and Kashmir, however, were checked. The Indians did not fully comprehend the magnitude of Arab political and economic ambitions. Along the west coast, the Arabs were seen as familiar traders from Western Asia. The possible competition with Indian trade was not realized. The Deccan. In the Deccan, the Vaktaka dynasty was closely tied to the Guptas. With a nucleus in Vidarbha, the founder of the dynasty, Vindhya Shakti, extended his power northward as far as Vidisha, near Ujjain. At the end of the 4th century, a collateral line of the Vaktakas was established by Sarvasena in Vatsagulma, Basim, in Akola district, and the northern line helped the southern to conquer Kuntala, southern Maharashtra. The domination of the northern Deccan by the main Vaktaka line during this period is clearly established by the matrimonial alliances not only with the Guptas but also with other peninsular dynasties such as the Visnukundans and the Kadambas. The Vaktakas were weakened by attacks from Malwa and Koshala in the 5th century. Ultimately, the Chalukyas of Vatapi, present-day Badami, ended their rule. The entire southern peninsula of India south of the Narmada River is marked centrally by a high triangular tableland called the Deccan. The name derives from the Sanskrit Dakshina, south. The plateau is bounded on the east and west by the Ghats ranges, escarpments, that meet at the plateau's southern tip. Its northern extremity is the Satpura range. The Deccan's average elevation is about 2,000 feet, 600 meters, sloping generally eastward. Its principal rivers, the Godavari, Krishna, and Kaveri, flow from the western Ghats eastward to the Bay of Bengal. The plateau's climate is drier than that on the coasts and is arid in places. The Deccan's early history is obscure. There is evidence of prehistoric human habitation. Low rainfall must have made farming difficult until the introduction of irrigation. The plateau's mineral wealth led many lowland rulers, including those of the Mauryan, 4th to 2nd century BCE, and Gupta, 4th to 6th century CE, dynasties, to fight over it. From the 6th to the 13th century, the Chalukya, Rashtrakuta, later Chalukya, Hosla, and Yadava families successively established regional kingdoms in the Deccan, but they were continually in conflict with neighboring states and recalcitrant feudatories. The later kingdoms also were subject to looting raids by the Muslim Delhi Sultanate, which eventually gained control of the area. In 1347, the Muslim Bahmani dynasty established an independent kingdom in the Deccan. The 5 Muslim states that succeeded the Bahmani and divided its territory joined forces in 1565 at the Battle of Talikota to defeat Vijayanagara, the Hindu Empire to the south. For most of their reigns, however, the 5 successor states formed shifting patterns of alliances in an effort to keep any one state from dominating the area and, from 1656, to fend off incursions by the Mughal Empire to the north. During the Mughal decline in the 18th century, the Marathas, the Nizam of Hyderabad, and the Arcot Nawab vied for control of the Deccan. Their rivalries, as well as conflicts over succession, led to the gradual absorption of the Deccan by the British. When India became independent in 1947, the princely state of Hyderabad resisted initially but joined the Indian Union in 1948. Of the myriad ruling families of the Deccan between the 4th and 7th centuries, including the Nalas, the Kalakiris, the Gangas, and the Kadambas, the most significant were the Chalukyas, who are associated with Vatapi in the 6th century. The Chalukyas controlled large parts of the Deccan for 2 centuries. There were many branches of the family, the most important of which were the Eastern Chalukyas, ruling at Pishtapura, modern Pithapuram in the Godavari River Delta. In the early 7th century, the Chalukyas of Vimalvada, near Karimnagar, Andhra Pradesh, and the renaissant later Chalukyas of Kalyani, between the Bhima and Godavari rivers, who rose to power in the 10th century. Chalukya power reached its zenith during the reign of Pulkeshin II, 610 to 642, a contemporary of Harsha. The early years of Pulakeshin's reign were taken up with a civil war, after which he had to reconquer lost territories and re-establish his control over recalcitrant feudatories. Pulkeshin then campaigned successfully in the south against the Kadambas, the Alupas, and the Gangas. Leading his armies north, he defeated the Latas, Malwas, and Gurjaras. Pulakeshin's final triumph in the north was a victory over Harsha of Kannauj. Pulkeshin then turned his attention to the eastern Deccan and conquered southern Koshala, Kalinga, Pishtapuram, and the Vishnukundin kingdom. He started the collateral branch of the eastern Chalukyas based at Pishtapuram with his younger brother Vishnuvardhana as the first king. Pulkeshin then launched another major campaign against the powerful southern Indian kingdom of the Pallavas, in which he defeated their king Mahindavarman I, thus inaugurating a conflict between the two kingdoms that was to continue for many centuries. Pulkeshin to send an embassy to the court of the Sasaniya Persian king Khosrav II. Good relations between the Persians and the Indians of the Deccan were of great advantage to the Zoroastrians of Persia, who, fleeing from the Islamic persecution in subsequent centuries, sought asylum in India and settled along the west coast of the Deccan. Their descendants today constitute the Parsi community. Control over both coasts enhanced the Chalukya kings' already firm hold on the Deccan. The major river valleys of the plateau, the Narmada, Tapi, Tapti, Godavari with its tributaries, and Krishna, were in Chalukya hands, as were the valuable routes in the valleys. This amounted to control of the west coast trade with Western Asia, and the Kalinga and Andhra trade on the east coast with Southeast Asia. The centuries-long conflict between the northern and the southern Deccan, of which the Chalukya-Pallava conflict was but a facet, also had geographic, political, and economic causes. Any southern Indian power seeking to expand would inevitably try to move up the east coast, which was not only the most fertile area of the peninsula, but was also wealthy from the income of trade with Southeast Asia. Therefore, control of the northern Deccan required control of the east coast as well. With the major maritime activity gradually concentrating on Southeast Asian trade, in which even the west coast had a large share, the control of both coasts was of considerable economic advantage. It was along the east coast, therefore, that the conflict between the two regions often erupted. The next 100 years of Chalukya power witnessed the continuation of this conflict, weakening both contenders. Ultimately, in the mid-8th century, a feudatory of the Chalukyas, Danti Durga of the Rashtrakuta dynasty, rose to importance and established himself in place of the declining Chalukya dynasty. The eastern Chalukyas, who had managed to avoid involvement in the conflict, survived longer and came into conflict with the Rashtrakutas. Another branch of the Chalukyas established itself at Lata in the mid-7th century and played a prominent role in obstructing the Arab advance. Southern India. The southern part of the peninsula split into many kingdoms, each fighting for supremacy. Sera power relied mainly on a flourishing trade with Western Asia. The Cholas retired into insignificance in the Uriyur, Tiruchirappalli area. The Pandyas were involved in fighting the rising power of the Pallavas, and occasionally they formed alliances with the Deccan kingdoms. The origin of the Pallava dynasty is obscure. It is not even clear whether the early Pallavas of the 3rd century were the ancestors of the later Pallavas of the 6th century, who are sometimes distinguished by the title imperial. It would seem, though, that their place of origin was Tondamandalam, with its center at Kachipuram, ancient Kanchi. Prakrit copperplate charters issued by the early kings from Kachipuram often mention places just to the north in Andhra Pradesh, suggesting that the dynasty may have migrated to the Kachipuram area. The Sanskrit and Tamil epigraphic records of the later kings of the dynasty indicate that the later Pallavas became dominant in the 6th century after a successful attack against the Calabras, which extended their territory as far south as the Kaveri River. The Pallavas reached their zenith during the reign of Mahendravarman I, c. 600 to 630, a contemporary of Harsha and Pulkeshin II. Among the sources of the period, Xuanzang's account serves as a link as he travelled through the domains of all 3 kings. The struggle for Vengi between the Pallavas and the Chalukyas became the immediate pretext for a long, drawn-out war, which began with the defeat of the Pallavas. Apart from his campaigns, Mahendravarman was a writer and artist of some distinction. The play associated with him, Bhattavilasa Prasanna, treats in a farcical manner the idiosyncrasies of Buddhist and Shiva-ascetics. Mahendravarman's successor, Narsinhavarman I, reigned c. 630 to 668, also called Mahamal or Mamala, avenged the Pallava defeat by capturing Vatapi. He sent 2 naval expeditions from Mahabalipuram to Sri Lanka to assist the king Manvamma in regaining his throne. Pallava naval interests laid the foundation for extensive reliance on the navy by the succeeding dynasty, the Cholas. Toward the end of the 8th century, the Gangas and the Pandyas joined coalitions against the Pallavas. As the Chalukyas declined under pressure from the Rashtrakutas, the Pandyas gradually took on the Pallavas and, by the mid-9th century, advanced as far as Kumbakonam. This defeat was avenged, but, by the end of the 9th century, Pallava power had ceased to be significant. Society and culture. Some of the Pallava kings took an interest in the Alvars and Nayanas, the religious teachers who preached a new form of Vaishnavism and Shaivism based on the Bhakti. Devotional cults. Among the Shaivas were Appar, who is said to have converted Mahendravarman from Jainism, and Manik Kavkar. Among the Vaishnavas were Nammalvar, and a woman teacher, Andal. The movement aimed at preaching a popular Hinduism, in which Tamil was preferred to Sanskrit, and emphasized the role of the peripatetic teacher. Women were encouraged to participate in the congregations. The Tamil devotional cult and similar movements elsewhere were, in a sense, competitive with Buddhism and Jainism, both of which suffered a gradual decline in most areas. Jainism found a foothold in Karnataka, Rajasthan, and Gujarat. Buddhism flourished in eastern India, with major monastic centers at Nalanda, Vikramshila, and Paharpur that attracted vast numbers of students from India and abroad. Tibetan and Eastern Indian cults, particularly the Tantric cults, influenced the development of Vajrayana, thunderbolt vehicle, Buddhism. The widespread Shakti cult associated with Hindu practice was based on the notion that the male can be activated only by union with the female. Thus, the gods were given consorts, Lakshmi or Shri for Vishnu, Parvati, Kali, and Durga for Shiva, and ritual was directed toward the worship of the mother goddess. Much of the ritual was derived from the earlier fertility cults and local rites and beliefs that were assimilated into Hinduism. During the same period, Orthodox Brahmanism received encouragement, especially from the royal families. Learned Brahmins were given endowments of land. The performance of Vedic sacrifices for purposes of royal legitimacy gave way to the keeping of genealogies, which the Brahmins now controlled. The new Brahmanism acquired a locality and an institution in the form of the temple. The earliest remains of a Hindu temple, discovered at Sanchi, date to the Gupta period. These extremely simple structures consisted of a shrine room, called a Garbhagraha, womb house, or Sanctum Sanctorum, which contained an image of the deity and opened onto a porch. Over the centuries, additional structures were added until the temple complexes covered many acres. In the peninsula, the early rock-cut temples imitated Buddhist models. Although the Chalukyas did introduce freestanding temples, most of their patronage extended to rock-cut monuments. The Pallavas also began with rock-cut temples, as at Mahabalipur, but when they took to freestanding temples, they produced the most impressive examples of their time. As temples and monasteries became larger and more complex, the decorative arts of mural painting and sculpture flourished. Early examples of mural painting occur at Bagh and Sittanvassal, now in Tamil Nadu, and the tradition reached its apogee in the murals at the Ajanta caves, Maharashtra, during the Vaktaka and Chalukya periods. The fashion for murals in Buddhist monasteries spread from India to Afghanistan and Central Asia and ultimately to China. Equally impressive was the Buddhist sculpture at Sarnath in Uttar Pradesh. It is possible that the proliferation of Buddhist images led to the depiction of Hindu deities in iconic form. Temples were richly endowed with wealth and land, and the larger institutions could accommodate colleges of higher learning, ghatikas and mathas, primarily for priests. These colleges became responsible for much of the formal education, and inevitably the use of Sanskrit became widespread. There was an appreciable development of Hindu philosophy, which now recognized 6 major systems: Darshan, Nyaya, Vaishesika, Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. Indicative of the growing domination of Brahmanic intellectual life, the ancient Puranas were now written substantially in their present form under Brahmanic influence. The flowering of classical Sanskrit literature is indicated by the plays and poems of Kalidasa, Abhijnana Shakuntala, Malviknagnimitra, Vikramorvashi, Raghuvamsha, Meghdutta, although Kalidasa's precise date is uncertain. In the south, the propagation of Sanskrit resulted in the Kirtajuniya, an epic written by Bharvi, 7th century, in Dandin's Dashakumara Charita, a collection of popular stories, 6th century, and in Bhavbhutis play Malti Madhva. Tamil literature flourished as well, as evidenced by 2 didactic works, the Tirukkural, by Tiruvalluvar, and Naldiyar, and by the more lyrical Silappadikram and Manimekhlai, 2 Tamil epics. Representing a less common genre of literature in the Gupta period was the Kama Sutra of Vatsyayana, a manual on the art of love. This was a collation and revision of earlier texts and displays a remarkable sophistication and urbanity. It was a period of literary excellence, though in the other arts such levels of excellence came later. Not all the achievements can be associated with the Gupta dynasty. The monasteries and temples were centers of formal learning, and the guilds were centers of technical knowledge. The mixture of the theoretical and practical, however, sometimes occurred, as in the case of medicine, particularly veterinary science. Advances in metallurgy are attested in such objects as the Sultanganj Buddha and a famous iron pillar now at Mehrauli, Delhi. Gold and silver coins of the Gupta period exhibit a refinement that was not to be surpassed for many centuries. Mathematics was particularly advanced, probably more so than anywhere in the world at the time. Indian numerals were later borrowed by the Arabs and introduced to Europe as Arabic numerals. The use of the cipher and the decimal system is confirmed by inscriptions. With advances in mathematics, there was comparable progress in astronomy. Aryabhatta I, writing in 499, calculated pi to 3.1416 and the solar year to 365.3586 days and stated that the earth was spherical and rotated on its axis. That European astronomy was also known is suggested by the 6th century astronomer Varhamihira, who mentions the Romka Siddhanta, school of Rome, among the 5 major schools of astronomy. Legal texts and commentaries were abundant, the better known being those of Yajnavalkya, Narada, Brihaspati, Katyayana. Earlier texts relating to social problems and property rights received particular attention. The post-Gupta period saw considerable and lasting social change, which resulted not only from outside influences but also from the interaction of the elite Sanskritic culture with more parochial non-Sanskritic cultures. The expanding village economy opened up new areas geographically, and the increasing importance of guilds in the towns indicated fresh perspectives on social life. These activities also incorporated new groups and cultures into the existing norms of Indian society. From 750 to c. 1200. In both North and South India, smaller kingdoms strove to dominate their neighbors. Yet despite the depredations of war, this period proved to be culturally rich and productive for much of the subcontinent. New influences flowed into the subcontinent from the sophisticated empires of Anatolia, Turkey. Northern India. The 8th century was a time of struggle for control over the central Ganges valley, focusing on Kannauj, among the Gurjara Pratihara, the Rashtrakuta, and the Pala dynasties. The tripartite struggle. The Pratiharas rose to power in the Avantijala region and used western India as a base. The Chalukyas fell about 753 to one of their own feudatories, the Rashtrakutas under Danti Durga, who established a dynasty. The Rashtrakuta interest in Kannauj probably centered on the trade routes from the Ganges valley. This was the first occasion on which a power based in the Deccan made a serious bid for a pivotal position in northern India. From the east, the Palas also participated in the competition. They are associated with Pundravarthana, near Bogra, Bengal, and their first ruler, Gopala, reigned c. 750 to 770, included Vanga in his kingdom and gradually extended his control to the whole of Bengal. Vatsaraja, a Pratihara ruler who came to the throne about 778, controlled eastern Rajasthan and Malwa. His ambition to take Kannauj brought him into conflict with the Pala king, Dharmapala, reigned c. 770 to 810, who had by this time advanced up the Ganges valley. The Rashtrakuta king Dhruva, reigned c. 780 to 793, attacked each in turn and claimed to have defeated them. This initiated a lengthy tripartite struggle. Dharmapala soon retook Kannauj and put his nominee on the throne. The Rashtrakutas were preoccupied with problems in the south. Vatsaraja's successor, Nagbhata II, reigned c. 793 to 833, reorganized Pratihara power, attacked Kannauj, and for a short while reversed the situation. However, soon afterward, he was defeated by the Rashtrakuta king Govinda III, reigned 793 to 814, who in turn had to face a confederacy of southern powers that kept him involved in Deccan politics, leaving northern India to the Pratihar Palas. Bhoja I, reigned c. 836 to 885, revived the power of the Pratiharas by bringing Kalanjara, and possibly Kannauj as well, under Pratihara control. Bhoja's plans to extend the kingdom, however, were thwarted by the Palas and the Rashtrakutas. More serious conflict with the latter ensued during the reign of Krishna II, reigned c. 878 to 914. An Arab visitor to western India, the merchant Suleiman, referred to the kingdom of Juzra, which is generally identified as Gurjara, and its strong and able ruler, who may have been Bhoja. Of the successors of Bhoja, the only one of significance was Mahipala, reigned c. 908 to 942, whose relationship with the earlier king remains controversial. Rajashekhara, a renowned poet at his court, implies that Mahipala restored the kingdom to its original power, but this may be an exaggeration. By the end of the 10th century, the Pratihara feudatories, Kohans, Kahamanas, Chandelas, Kandelas, Guhilas, Kalakuris, Parmaras, and Chalukyas, also called Solankis, were asserting their independence, although the last of the Pratiharas survived until 1027. Meanwhile, Devpala, reigned c. 810 to 850, was reasserting Pala authority in the east and, he claimed, in the northern Deccan. At the end of the 9th century, however, the Pala kingdom declined, with feudatories in Kamrupa, modern Assam, and Utkala, Orissa, taking independent titles. Pala power revived during the reign of Mahipala, reigned c. 988 to 1038, although its stronghold now was Bihar rather than Bengal. Further attempts to recover the old Pala territories were made by Rampala, but Pala power gradually declined. There was a brief revival of power in Bengal under the Sena dynasty, c. 1070 to 1289. In the Rashtrakuta kingdom, Amoghavarsa, reigned c. 814 to 878, faced a revolt of officers and feudatories but managed to survive and reassert Rashtrakuta power despite intermittent rebellions. Campaigns in the south against Vengi and the Gangas kept Amoghavarsa preoccupied and prevented him from participating in northern politics. The Rashtrakuta capital was moved to Manekheta, Andhra Pradesh, doubtlessly to facilitate southern involvements, which clearly took on more important dimensions at this time. Sporadic campaigns against the Pratiharas, the eastern Chalukyas, and the Cholas, the new power of the south, continued. Indra III, reigned 914 to 927, captured Kannauj, but, with mounting political pressures from the south, his control over the north was inevitably short-lived. The reign of Krishna III, reigned c. 939 to 968, saw a successful campaign against the Cholas, a matrimonial alliance with the Gangas, and the subjugation of Vengi. Rashtrakuta power declined suddenly, however, after the reign of Indra, and this was fully exploited by the feudatory Tela. Tela II, reigned 973 to 997, who traced his ancestry to the earlier Chalukyas of Vatapi, ruled a small part of Bijapur. Upon the weakening of Rashtrakuta power, he defeated the king, declared his independence, and founded what has come to be called the later Chalukya dynasty. The kingdom included much of Karnataka, Konkan, and the territory as far north as the Godavari River. By the end of the 10th century, the later Chalukyas clashed with the ambitious Cholas. The Chalukyas' capital was subsequently moved north to Kalyani, near Bidar, in Karnataka. Campaigns against the Cholas took a more serious turn during the reign of Someshwara I, reigned 1043 to 68, with alternating defeat and victory. The later Chalukyas, however, by and large retained control over the western Deccan despite the hostility of the Cholas and of their own feudatories. In the middle of the 12th century, however, a feudatory, Bijla, reigned 1156 to 67, of the Kalachuri dynasty, usurped the throne. At Kalyani, the last of the Chalukya rulers, Someshwara IV, reigned 1181 to c. 1189, regained the throne for a short period, after which he was overthrown by a feudatory of the Yadava dynasty. On the periphery of the large kingdoms were the smaller states such as Nepal, Kamrupa, Kashmir, and Utkala, Orissa, and lesser dynasties such as the Shilharas in Maharashtra. Nepal had freed itself from Tibetan suzerainty in the 8th century but remained a major trade route to Tibet. Kamrupa, with its capital at Pragajyotisapura, near present-day Guwahati, was one of the centers of the Tantric cult. In 1253, a major part of Kamrupa was conquered by the Ahom, a Shan people. Politics in Kashmir were dominated by turbulent feudatories seeking power. By the 11th century, Kashmir was torn between rival court factions, and the oppression by Harsha accentuated the suffering of the people. Smaller states along the Himalayan foothills managed to survive without becoming too embroiled in the politics of the plains. The Rajputs. In Rajasthan and central India, there arose a number of small kingdoms ruled by dynasties that came to be called the Rajputs, from Sanskrit Rajputra, son of a king. The name was assumed by royal families that claimed Kshatriya status and linked their lineage either with the Suryavanshi, solar, or the Kandravamshi, lunar, the royal lineages of the Itihas Purana tradition, or else with the Agnikula, fire lineage, based on a lesser myth in which the eponymous ancestor arises out of the sacrificial fire. The four major Rajput dynasties, Pratihara, Parmara, Chauhan, and Chalukya, claimed Agnikula lineage. The references in Rajput genealogies to supernatural ancestry suggest either an obscure origin, perhaps from semi-Hinduist local tribes who gradually acquired political and economic status, or else a non-Indian, probably Central Asian, origin. The Chalukyas of Gujarat had three branches, one ruling Matamira, the Malvasadi region, one established on the former kingdom of the Kapas at Anahilpatka, present-day Patan, and the third at Brigukacha, present-day Baruch, and Lata in the coastal area. By the 11th century, they were using Gujarat as a base and attempting to annex neighboring portions of Rajasthan and Avanti. Kumarpala, reigned c. 1143 to 72, was responsible for consolidating the kingdom. He is also believed to have become a Jain and to have encouraged Jainism in western India. Hemachandra, an outstanding Jain scholar noted for his commentaries on political treatises, was a well-known figure at the Chalukya court. Many of the Rajput kingdoms had Jain statesmen, ministers, and even generals, as well as Jain traders and merchants. By the 14th century, however, the Chalukya kingdom had declined. Adjoining the kingdom of the Chalukyas was that of the Parmaras in Malwa, with minor branches in the territories just to the north, Mount Abu, Bansawara, Kungarpur, and Bhinmal. The Parmaras emerged as feudatories of the Rashtrakutas and rose to eminence during the reign of Bhoja. An attack by the Chalukyas weakened the Parmaras in 1143. Although the dynasty was later re-established, it remained weak. In the 13th century, the Parmaras were threatened by both rising Yadava power in the Deccan and the Turkish kingdom at Delhi. The latter conquered the Parmaras in 1305. The Kalachuris of Tripuri, near Jabalpur, also began as feudatories of the Rashtrakutas, becoming a power in central India in the 11th century during the reigns of Gangadeva and his son Lakshmikarna, when attempts were made to conquer territories as far afield as Utkala, Odisha, Bihar, and the Ganges to Yamuna Doab. There they came into conflict with the Turkish governor of the Punjab, who briefly had extended his territory as far as Varanasi. To the west there were conflicts with Bhoja Parmara, and the Kalakiris declined at the end of the 12th century. The Chandelas, whose kingdom comprised mainly Bundelkhand, were feudatories of the Pratiharas. Among the important rulers was Dhanga, reigned c. 950 to 1008, who issued a large number of inscriptions and was generous in donations to Jain and Hindu temples. Dhanga's grandson Vidyadhara, reigned 1017 to 29, often described as the most powerful of the Kandala kings, extended the kingdom as far as the Chambal and Narmada rivers. There he came into direct conflict with the Turkic conqueror Mahmud of Ghajna when the latter swept down from Afghanistan in a series of raids. But the ensuing battles were indecisive. The Chandelas also had to face the attacks of the Kohans, who were in turn being harassed by the Turks. The Turkish kingdom at Delhi encroached into Bundelkhand, but the Chandelas survived until the 16th century as minor chieftains. The Gardavlas rose to importance in Varanasi and extended their kingdom up the Gangetic plain, including Kannauj. The king Jayakendra, 12th century, is mentioned in the poem Prithviraj Raso by Ken Badai, in which his daughter, the princess Sanyogita, elopes with the Kohan king Prithviraja. Jayakendra died in battle against the Turkish leader, Muiz al-Din Muhammad ibn Sam, Muhammad of Ghur, and his kingdom was annexed. Inscriptional records associate the Kohans with Lake Shakambhari and its environs, Sambhar Salt Lake, Rajasthan. Kohan politics were largely campaigns against the Chalukyas and the Turks. In the 11th century the Kohans founded the city of Ajmer, in the southern part of their kingdom, and in the 12th century they captured Dhillika, Delhi, from the Tomaras and annexed some Tomara territory along the Yamuna river. Prithviraja III has come down both in folk and historical literature as the Kohan king who resisted the Turkish attacks in the first battle at Tarauri, Terrain, in 1191. Prithviraja, however, was defeated at a second battle in the same place in 1192. The defeat ushered in Turkish rule in northern India. The coming of the Turks. The establishment of Turkish power in India is initially tied up with politics in the Punjab. The Punjab was ruled by Jaipala of the Hindu Shahi family, Shahiya, which had in the 9th century wrested the Kabul valley and Gandhara from a Turkish Shah. Political and economic relations were extremely close between the Punjab and Afghanistan. Afghanistan in turn was closely involved with Central Asian politics. Sebuktigin, a Turk, was appointed governor of Ghajna in 977. He attacked the Hindu Shahis and advanced as far as Peshawar. His son Mahmud succeeded to the Ghajna principality in 998. Mahmud went to war with the Shahiya dynasty, and, almost every year until his death, in 1030, he led raids against the rich temple towns in northern and western India, using the wealth obtained from the raids to finance successful campaigns in Central Asia and build an empire there. He acquired a reputation as an iconoclast as well as a patron of culture, and was responsible for sending to India the scholar Al-Biruni, who studied Tariq al-Hind, the history of India, is a source of valuable information. Mahmud left his governors in the Punjab with a rather loose control over the region. In the 12th century the Ghurid Turks were driven out of Khorasan and later out of Ghajna by the Khwarizm Shah dynasty. Inevitably, the Ghurids sought their fortune in northern India, where the conflict between the Ghaznavids and the local rulers provided an excellent opportunity. Muhammad of Ghur advanced into the Punjab and captured Lahore in 1185. Victory in the Second Battle of Tarauri consolidated Muhammad's success, and he left his Mamluk, slave, General Kubaldeen Aibak, in charge of his Indian possessions. Muhammad was assassinated in 1206 on his way back to Afghanistan. Qutb al-Din remained in India and declared himself Sultan of Delhi, the first of the Mamluk dynasty. The Deccan and the South. In the northern Deccan, the decline of the later Chalukyas brought about the rise of their feudatories, among them the Yadava dynasty, also claiming descent from the Yadu tribe, based at Devgiri, Daulatabad, whose kingdom, Sundesha, included the broad swaths of what is now Maharashtra state. The kingdom expanded during the reign of Sinhana, reigned c. 1210–47, who campaigned against the Hosla in northern Karnataka, against the lesser chiefs of the western coast, and against the Kakatiya kingdom in the eastern Deccan. Turning northward, Singhana attacked the Parmaras and the Chalukyas. The Yadavas, however, facing the Turks to the north and the powerful Hoslas to the south, declined in the early 14th century. In the eastern Deccan, the Kakatiya dynasty was based in parts of what is now Andhra Pradesh state and survived until the Turkish attack in the 14th century. The eastern Chalukyas ruled in the Godavari river delta, and in the 13th century their fortunes were tied to those of the Cholas. The eastern Gangas, ruling in Kalinga, came into conflict with the Turks advancing down the Ganges river valley to the delta during the 13th century. The Cholas. The Cholas, Kolas, were by far the most important dynasty in the subcontinent at this time, although their activities mainly affected the peninsula and Southeast Asia. The nucleus of Chola power during the reign of Vijayalaya in the late 9th century was Tanjavur, from which the Cholas spread northward, annexing in the 10th century what remained of Pallava territory. To the south they came up against the Pandyas. Chola history can be reconstructed in considerable detail because of the vast number of lengthy inscriptions issued not only by the royal family, but also by temple authorities, village councils, and trade guilds. Parantaka I, reigned 907 to 953, laid the foundation of the kingdom. He took the northern boundary up to Nellore, Andhra Pradesh, where his advance was stopped by a defeat at the hands of the Rashtrakuta king Krishna III. Parantaka was more successful in the south, where he defeated both the Pandyas and the Gangas. He also launched an abortive attack on Sri Lanka. For 30 years after his death, there was a series of feeble reigns that did not strengthen the Chola position. There then followed two outstanding rulers who rapidly reinstated Chola power and ensured the kingdom its supremacy. These were Rajaraja I and Rajendra. Rajaraja, reigned 985 to 1014, began establishing power with attacks against the Pandyas and Illamandalam of Sri Lanka. Northern Sri Lanka became a province of the Chola kingdom. A campaign against the Gangas and Chalukyas extended the Chola boundary north to the Tungabhadra river. On the eastern coast, the Cholas battled with the Chalukyas for the possession of Vengi. A marriage alliance gave the Cholas an authoritative position, but Vengi remained a bone of contention. A naval campaign led to the conquest of the Maldive Islands, the Malabar coast, and northern Sri Lanka, all of which were essential to the Chola control over trade with Southeast Asia and with Arabia and Eastern Africa. These were the transit areas, ports of call for the Arab traders and ships to Southeast Asia and China, which were the source of the valuable spices sold at a high profit to Europe. Rajraja's son Rajendra participated in his father's government from 1012, succeeded him 2 years later, and ruled until 1044. To the north he annexed the Raichur Doab, the interflow between the Krishna and Tungabhadra rivers in Karnataka, and moved into Manekheta in the heart of Chalukya territory. A revolt against Mahinda V of Sri Lanka gave Rajendra the excuse to conquer southern Sri Lanka as well. In 1021-20 the no-famous Northern Campaign was launched. The Chola army campaigned along the east coast as far as Bengal, and then north to the Ganges River, almost the exact rivers of Samudragupta's campaign to Kachipuram in the 4th century CE. The most spectacular campaign, however, was a naval campaign against the Srivijaya Empire in Southeast Asia in 1025. The reason for the assault on Srivijaya and neighboring areas appears to have been the interference with Indian shipping and mercantile interests seeking direct trading connections with southern China. The Chola victory reinstated these connections, and throughout the 11th century Chola trading missions visited China. The Hoslas and Pandyas. The succession after Rajendra is confused until the emergence of Kulottunga I, reigned 1070-1122, but his reign was the last of any significance. The 12th and 13th centuries saw a gradual decline in Chola power, accelerated by the rise of the Hoslas to the west and the Pandyas to the south. The Hoslas began as hill chieftains northwest of Dorasamudra, modern Halebid, feudatory to the Chalukyas. Vishnuvardhana consolidated the kingdom in the 12th century. The Hoslas were involved in conflict with the Yadava kingdom, which was seeking to expand southward, particularly during the reign of Ballala II, reigned 1173-1220. Hostilities also developed with the Cholas to the east. The armies of the Turks eroded the Hosla kingdom until, in the 14th century, it gave way to the newly emerging Vijayanagara Empire. In the 13th century the Pandyas became the dominant power in the south, but their supremacy was brief because they were attacked in the 14th century by Turkish armies. Information on the dynasty is supplemented by the colorful account of Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who visited the region in 1288 and 1293. Society and culture. Apart from the political events of the time, a common development in the subcontinent was the recognizable decentralization of administration and revenue collection. From the Chola kingdom there are long inscriptions on temple walls referring to the organization and functioning of village councils. Villages that had been donated to Brahmins had councils called sabhas. In the non-Brahmin villages the council was called the Ur. Eligibility qualifications generally relating to age and ownership of property were indicated, along with procedural rules. The council was divided into various committees in charge of the different aspects of village life and administration. Among the responsibilities of the council was the collection of revenue and the supervision of irrigation. References to village bodies and local councils also occur in inscriptions from other regions. A more recent and much contested view held by some historians holds that the Chola state was a segmentary state with control decreasing from the center outward and a ritual hierarchy that determined the relations between the center and the units of the territory. The nature of the state during this period has been the subject of widespread discussion among historians. In the Deccan the rise and fall of dynasties was largely the result of the feudatory pattern of political relationships. The same held true of northern India and is seen both in the rise of various Rajput dynasties and in their inability to withstand the Turkish invasions. There is considerable controversy among historians as to whether it would be accurate to describe the feudatory pattern as feudalism per se. Some argue that, Although it was not identical to the classic example of feudalism in Western Europe, there are sufficient similarities to allow the use of the term. Others contend that the dissimilarities are substantial, such as the apparent absence of an economic contract involving king, vassal, and serf. In any event, the patterns of land relations, politics, and culture changed considerably, and the major characteristic of the change consists of forms of decentralization. The commonly used term for a feudatory was samantha, which designated either a conquered ruler or a secular official connected with the administration, who had been given a grant of land in lieu of a salary, and who had asserted ownership over the land and gradually appropriated rights of ruling the area. There were various categories of samanthas. As long as a ruler was in a feudatory status, he called himself samantha and acknowledged his overlord in official documents and charters. Independent status was indicated by the elimination of the title of samantha and the inclusion instead of royal titles such as Maharaja and Maharadhiraja. The feudatory had certain obligations to the ruler, although virtually in sole control administratively and fiscally over the land granted to him. He nevertheless had to pay a small percentage of the revenue to the ruler and maintain a specified body of troops for him. He was permitted the use of certain symbols of authority on formal occasion and was required, if called upon, to give his daughter in marriage to his suzerain. These major administrative and economic changes, although primarily concerning fiscal arrangements and revenue organization, also had their impact on politics and culture. The grantees or intermediaries in a hierarchy of grants were not merely secular officials, but were often Brahman beneficiaries who had been given grants of land in return for religious services rendered to the state. The grants were frequently so lucrative that the Brahmins could marry into the families of local chiefs, which explains the presence of Brahmin ancestors in the genealogies of the period. The economy. Cultivation was still carried out by the peasants, generally Sudras, who remained tied to the land. Since the revenue was now to be paid not to the king, but to the Samantha, the peasants naturally began to give more attention to his requirements. Although the Samanthas copied the lifestyle of the royal court, often to the point of setting up miniature courts in imitation of the royal model, the system also encouraged parochial loyalties and local cultural interests. One manifestation of this local involvement was a sudden spurt of historical literature such as Bilhana's Vikramankara Vikirita, the life of the Chalukya king Vikramaditya VI, and Kalhana's Rajtarandini, a history of Kashmir. The earlier decline in trade was gradually reversed in this period, with trade centers emerging in various parts of the subcontinent. Some urban centers developed from points of exchange for agrarian produce, whereas others were involved in long-distance trade. In some cases, traders from elsewhere settled in India, such as the Arabs on the Malabar coast. In other cases, Indian traders went to distant lands. Powerful trading guilds could enjoy political and military support, as was the case during the Chola monarchy. Even the rich Hindu temples of southern India invested their money in trade. Pala contacts were mainly with Srivijaya, and trade was combined with Buddhist interests. The monasteries at Nalanda and Vikramshila maintained close relations. By now, eastern India was the only region with a sizable Buddhist presence. The traditional trade routes were still used, and some kingdoms drew their revenue from such routes as those along the Aravali range, Malwa, and the Chambal and Narmada valleys. Significantly, the major technological innovation, the introduction of the Sakya, Persian wheel, or Arghatta, as an aid to irrigation in northern India, pertains to agrarian life and not to urban technology. Social mobility. Historians once believed that the post-Gupta period brought greater rigidity in the caste structure, and that this rigidity was partially responsible for the inability of Indians to face the challenge of the Turks. This view is now being modified. The distinctions, particularly between the Brahmins and the other castes, were in theory sharper, but in practice it now appears that social restrictions were not so rigid. Brahmins often lived off the land and founded dynasties. Most of the groups claiming Kshatriya status had only recently acquired it. The conscious reference to being Kshatriya, a characteristic among Rajputs, is a noticeable feature in post-Gupta politics. The fact that many of these dynasties were of obscure origin suggests some social mobility. A person of any caste, having once acquired political power, could also acquire a genealogy connecting him with the traditional lineages and conferring Kshatriya status. A number of new castes, such as the Kayasthas, scribes, and Khatris, traders, are mentioned in the sources of this period. According to the Brahmanic sources, they originated from intercaste marriages, but this is clearly an attempt at rationalizing their rank in the hierarchy. Many of these new castes played a major role in society. The hierarchy of castes did not have a uniform distribution throughout the country. But the preeminent position of the Brahmin was endorsed not merely by the fact that many had lands and investments, but also by the fact that they controlled education. Formal learning was virtually restricted to the institutions attached to the temples. Technical knowledge was available in the various artisan guilds. Hierarchy existed, however, even among the Brahmins. Some Brahmin castes, who had perhaps been tribal priests before being assimilated into the Sanskritic tradition, remained ordinary village priests catering to the day-to-day religious functions. Religion. The local nucleus of the new culture led to a large range of religious expression, from the powerful temple religion of Brahmanism to a widespread popular bhakti religion, and even more widespread fertility cults. The distinctions between the three were not clearly demarcated in practice. Rites and concepts from each flowed into the other. The formal worship of Vishnu and Shiva had the support of the elite. Temples dedicated to Vaishnava and Shaiva deities were the most numerous. But also included were some of the chief deities connected with the fertility cult, and the mother goddesses played an important role. The Puranas had been rewritten to incorporate popular religion. Now the Upuranas were written to record rites and worship of more localized deities. Among the more popular incarnations of Vishnu was Krishna, who, as the cowherd deity, accommodated pastoral and erotic themes in worship. The love of Krishna and Radha was expressed in sensitive and passionate poetry. The introduction of the erotic theme in Hinduism was closely connected with the fertility cult and Tantrism. The latter, named for its scriptures, the Tantras, influenced both Hindu and Buddhist ritual. Tantrism, as practiced by the elite, represented the conversion of a widespread folk religion into a sophisticated one. The emphasis on the mother goddess, related to that expressed in the Sakti cult, strengthened the status of the female deities. The erotic aspect also was related to the importance of ritual caution in some tantric rites. The depiction of erotic scenes on temple walls therefore had a magico-religious context. Vajrayana Buddhism, current in eastern India, Nepal, and Tibet, shows evidence of the impact of Tantrism. The goddess Tara emerges as the savior and is in many ways the Buddhist counterpart of Shakti. Buddhism was on the way out. The Buddha had been incorporated as an avatar of Vishnu and had lost much of its popular appeal, which had been maintained by the simple habits of the monks. The traditional source of Buddhist patronage had dwindled with declining trade. Jainism, however, managed to maintain some hold in Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Karnataka. The protest aspect of both Buddhism and Jainism, especially the opposition to Brahmanic orthodoxy, had now been taken over by the Tantrists and the Bhakti cults. The Tantrists expressed their protest through some rather extreme rites, as did some of the heretical sects such as the Kalamukhas and Kapalikas. The Bhakti cults expressed the puritanical protest of the urban groups, gradually spreading to the rural areas. Preeminent among the Bhakti groups during this period were the Lingayats, or Virshaivas, who were to become a powerful force in Karnataka, and the Pandharpur cult in Maharashtra, which attracted such preachers as Namdeva and Gyaneshwara. Literature and the arts. It was also in the Matha monastery and the Ghatika assembly hall attached to the temples that the influential philosophical debates were conducted in Sanskrit. Foremost among the philosophers were Shankara, 8th to 9th century, Ramanuj, d. 1137, and Madhva, 13th century. The discussions centered on religious problems, such as whether knowledge or devotion was the more effective means of salvation, and problems of metaphysics, including that of the nature of reality. Court literature, irrespective of the region, continued to be composed in Sanskrit, with the many courts competing for the patronage of the poets and the dramatists. There was a revival of interest in earlier literature, generating copious commentaries on prosody, grammar, and technical literature. The number of lexicons increased, perhaps necessitated by the growing use of Sanskrit by non-Sanskrit speakers. Literary style tended to be pedantic and imitative, although there were notable exceptions, such as Jayadev's lyrical poem on the love of Radha and Krishna, the Gita Govinda. The Bhakti teachers preached in the local languages, giving a tremendous stimulus to literature in these languages. Adaptations of the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Bhagavad Gita were used regularly by the Bhakti teachers. There was thus a gradual breaking away from Sanskrit and the Prakrit languages via the Apabhramsha language, and the eventual emergence and evolution of such languages as Kannada, Telugu, Marathi, Gujarati, Bengali, and Odia, and of the Bihari languages. The period was rich in sculpture, in both stone and metal, each region registering a variant style. Western India and Rajasthan emphasized ornateness, with the Jain temples at Mount Abu attaining a perfection of Rococo. Nalanda was the center of striking but less ornate images in black stone and of Buddhist bronze icons. Central Indian craftsmen used the softer sandstone. In the peninsula, the profusely sculptured rock-cut temples, such as the Kailas at the Ellora caves, under Chalukya and Rashtrakuta patronage, displayed a style of their own. The dominant style in the south was that of Chola sculpture, particularly in bronze. The severe beauty and elegance of these bronze images, mainly of Shaiva and Vaishnav deities and saints, remains unsurpassed. A new genre of painting that rose to popularity in Nepal, Eastern India, and Gujarat was the illustration of Buddhist and Jain manuscripts with miniature paintings. Temple architecture was divided into three main styles, Nagara, Dravida, and Vasara, which were distinguished by the ground plan of the temple and by the shape of the Shikhara, tower, that rose over the Garbhagriha, cubical structure, and that became the commanding feature of temple architecture. The North Indian temples conformed to the Nagara style, as is seen at Osia, Rajasthan state, Khajuraho, Madhya Pradesh state, and Konarka, Bhubaneswar, and Puri, Odisha state. The Orissa temples, however, remain nearest to the original archetype. South Indian temple architecture, or Dravida style, with its commanding gopuras, gateways, can be seen in the Rajarajeshwara and the Gangaikonda temples. The Deccani style, Vasar, tended to be an intermixture of the northern and the southern, with early examples at Vatapi, Aihole, and Pattadakal, and later at Halebid, Belur, and Somnathpur in the vicinity of Mysore. The wealth of the temples made them the focus of attack from plunderers. The question that is frequently posed as to why the Turks so easily conquered northern India and the Deccan has in part to do with what might be called the medieval ethos. A contemporary observed that the Indians had become self-centered and unaware of the world around them. This was substantially true. There was little interest in the politics of neighboring countries or in their technological achievements. The medieval ethos expressed itself not only in the feudatory attitude toward politics and the parochial concerns that became dominant and prevented any effective opposition to the Turks, but also in the trappings of chivalry and romanticism that became central to elite activity. It has been generally held that the medieval period of Indian history began with the arrival of the Turks, dated to either 1000 or 1206 CE, because the Turks brought with them a new religion, Islam, which changed Indian society at all levels. Yet the fundamental changes that took place about the 8th century, when the medieval ethos was introduced, would seem far more significant as criteria